When Tom and I moved into our new house on the outskirts of the city, I thought it would mark the beginning of a new, happy chapter in our lives. The house itself seemed like something out of a fairy tale. Bright walls, large windows that let in the warm daylight, and a small, well-kept garden in front. Everything looked perfect, at first glance. Around us stretched quiet streets, the houses stood in neat rows, and it seemed as though every yard was full of peace and comfort. I could imagine cupcakes baking in the neighboring kitchens in the morning, children playing on the green lawns, and the evening scent of barbecue blending with the coolness of the sunset. Everything about this place said it was perfect for a family. For us. However, on the second day after the move, Tom was already lost in work, leaving no time for us to settle into our new home together. He left at 6 a.m., barely kissing me goodbye, and returned when darkness had already taken over the windows. I heard the creak of the front door, then footsteps, but I didn't even feel like getting out of bed to greet him. A wave of tiredness and some disappointment washed over me. This wasn't how I had imagined our new house. Our new life. Tom entered the bedroom without turning on the light, quietly walked past the bed and sat down in the chair by the window. I heard him sigh heavily. "How was work?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Fine," Tom answered, staring absently at the darkness outside the window. Every morning became increasingly dreary for me. Tom would leave for work early, leaving me alone in the large empty house, and return late, exhausted and silent. Our conversations boiled down to simple questions, which felt more like formalities than actual exchanges of thoughts or feelings. "How was your day?" I would ask, trying to fill the gaps between us somehow. "Fine," he would reply dryly, not even lifting his head from his phone. And again, "Fine." I hated that word. It sounded like a sentence. Inside, I felt as if I were stuck in a black and white film where there was no place for vivid emotions, just the endless repetition of routine scenes. I tried to find something to help me cope with the loneliness. I wandered through the quiet streets, visited local shops, searched for activities that could bring back a sense of life. But with each passing day, the emptiness inside grew more tangible. Sometimes I tried to fix things. I would prepare dinner, hoping it might spark some conversation or suggest taking a walk with Tom, but each time my efforts would crash against his fatigue and indifference. "Maybe we could go to the lake for the weekend?" I suggested one evening when he sat silently at his laptop. "I'm tired. Work is piling up. I need to finish this project." He cut me off without looking up from the screen. One day, as I was unpacking yet another box of things on the porch, a man approached our house. Tall, solidly built, with short hair that was slightly graying and a friendly smile. He greeted me, and I noticed that there was something open and sincere in his eyes, something I had been missing so much lately. "Hello," he said a bit hesitantly, as if unsure whether to start a conversation. "I'm Michael, your neighbor. I thought I'd stop by to say hello, since we live next to each other but haven't had a chance to meet." I smiled, a little surprised by this unexpected visit. Until then, I had hardly met any of our neighbors, and for a moment I felt a light sense of relief. At least someone had noticed my existence in this silent neighborhood. "Nice to meet you. I'm Lisa," I replied, extending my hand. "My husband and I just moved in. We haven't even had time to settle properly yet." "Moving is always stressful." Michael nodded. "If you need anything, feel free to ask. I've been living here for a long time, so I know the area well. I work as a trainer at the local gym, so if you ever think about getting into sports, I'd be happy to help. You know, if you'd like, I could show you a few places around here. There's a park not far from here with a great spot for yoga. My group practices there in the mornings, and you could join us if you're interested." "That would be great," I replied, somewhat unexpectedly. I was just thinking that it would be nice to start something new. We agreed to meet the next day at a local cafe, from where he promised to show me the park. After Michael left, I stood on the porch for a few minutes, wondering why I felt so relieved after that simple conversation. It seemed like nothing special, just meeting a neighbor. But something inside me had come alive. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, feeling a sense of anticipation as I got ready for our meeting. Tom, as always, had already left for work without saying a word. His absence no longer felt like just emptiness. It was a reminder of how far apart we had grown. When I arrived at the cafe, Michael was already waiting for me at a table by the window. He smiled and waved, and I noticed a faint feeling of anticipation inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. We sat down at the table, and I could feel the tension of the past few weeks gradually melting away. Here, next to this person, I felt comfortable. "How are you?" he asked, as if he knew I had something to say, even though we hadn't discussed my personal life. His question wasn't just polite. There was more care in it than in any of my recent conversations with Tom. "Honestly, I don't know. A bit lost," I replied, trying not to dive too deep into my problems, but there was an honesty in my voice that I couldn't hide. "That's normal." Michael nodded, leaning his elbows on the table. "Moving is always a change. Sometimes a good one, sometimes—" He paused for a moment. "Sometimes change forces you to make choices." We talked a bit more, and Michael suggested we head to the park. As we walked through the streets, he told me about the neighborhood, the people living here, and shared stories about his trainees. His lightness and sense of humor were a pleasant contrast to the tension I had been feeling lately. We strolled slowly along the paths, and I felt as though someone had lifted a heavy weight off my shoulders. "This is where I hold my yoga classes," Michael said when we reached a small green space shaded by tall trees. "You mentioned you wanted to try something new. Maybe this is just what you need." "Maybe," I smiled. I never thought yoga was for me. "It's never too late to try." Michael winked. "Sometimes new things help you see the familiar in a different light." For some reason, those words struck me. Maybe I did need to try something new, not just in sports, but in life, too. By the time we returned to the cafe, I already knew I would sign up for the classes. It was the first step towards something different from my usual routine. "I'm glad we met, Lisa," Michael said as we said goodbye. "Don't hesitate if you ever want to go for a walk again or just talk. Time alone is good, but sometimes conversations help more than you think." "Thank you, Michael. I think I'll take you up on that," I replied, feeling a warmth inside from his words. That day, I returned home with an unexpected sense of lightness. It was a strange, new feeling, and I caught myself thinking that I was looking forward to our next meeting. My meetings with Michael started happening more frequently. We would meet after yoga sessions or simply stroll through the park, discussing everything, from his training sessions to my attempts to rediscover myself in this new house, new neighborhood, and new life. One day, after a morning walk through the park, Michael looked at me, a bit embarrassed, and said, "You look much more relaxed, Lisa. Tom must be glad to have a wife like you." I tried to smile to hide my inner confusion, but something inside me shifted. Michael noticed and gently added, "Sorry if I said something wrong. It's just that you really have changed since we started meeting. You seem more confident somehow." I sighed, pausing for a second to consider whether to continue this conversation, but the words spilled out on their own. "Tom doesn't notice. It feels like he stopped noticing a long time ago. Our relationship has become, well, I don't even know how to explain it. We've become strangers." Michael remained silent, giving me space to speak. His attentive expression, full of understanding, helped me open up. I felt how he listened, without judgment, without interruption, just allowing me to voice what I had been holding inside for so long. "I miss his attention," I continued, my voice growing quieter. "We barely talk. Sometimes it feels like he'd rather not notice my existence at all." "That's a tough situation," Michael said, frowning slightly. "You know, sometimes people just get stuck in life, and they don't realize that someone beside them is suffering. They forget that relationships need more than just time. They need attention." His words brought forth a wave of recognition of what I had been feeling but couldn't quite articulate. Yes, Tom and I were stuck. Life with him had become an endless loop where neither of us took steps to change anything. After that conversation, I could no longer look at my meetings with Michael as simply friendly. I returned home that evening feeling unsettled. Inevitably, the question arose, what do I really feel for Michael? And what does this mean for my relationship with Tom? The next day, Michael and I met at the cafe again. We sat at the same table as the first time. Michael was talking about his training sessions, but I was barely listening. My thoughts kept circling around what had long stopped being just a minor issue. At some point, I couldn't hold it in any longer and interrupted him. Michael, I started, unsure of how to put into words what was on my mind. You know, things with Tom are worse than I thought. We've just disappeared from each other's lives. He looked at me attentively, shifting slightly closer. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding, and that gave me the strength to continue. We don't talk. We don't share our thoughts. He's always busy with work, and when he comes home, he doesn't care about what's going on in my life. It's like I've become furniture in the house. Something that's just there but no longer noticed. We don't even argue anymore. We simply have nothing to talk about. I feel like a stranger in his life. Michael nodded but stayed silent. He knew that it was important for me to speak. I've tried to talk to him, I continued. I've tried to bring back something we used to have. But every time he retreats into his work or just says, everything's fine. But it's not fine for me. I can't live like this, being married and feeling so alone. It's not your fault, Lisa, Michael said softly. Sometimes people just get lost in their own lives and forget about those around them. Tom seems to not see that you're still here, needing him. But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. I nodded, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. Michael withdrew his hand, but his words kept echoing in my mind. He understood me better than anyone else. I felt that more with each conversation we had. You don't deserve to be in the shadows, Lisa, Michael continued. No one should feel like they're not needed. But sometimes you have to ask yourself, is the person beside you willing to fight for this relationship? His question caught me off guard. Was Tom willing to fight? I didn't know. In fact, I wasn't even sure if he realized how distant I'd become. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think that maybe we had already passed the point where our marriage could be saved. Michael looked at me with compassion, but I could sense something more in his gaze. The attention he gave me, his care and understanding were exactly what I had been missing. I realized more and more that Tom might no longer be capable of giving me what had once been the foundation of our relationship. The next day, after the workout, Michael suggested we take a walk in the park. It had become a familiar ritual. After our sessions, we often walked past the lake, discussing little things. But this time, something was different. The quiet autumn weather, the light breeze, the rustling leaves underfoot. Everything around us seemed perfectly peaceful. But inside, I was bubbling with unease. We were walking along the lake when Michael suddenly stopped. He looked at me in a way he had never looked before, and I felt myself tense up. I knew that something important was happening between us in that moment, but I couldn't explain what exactly. Lisa, he said softly, his voice gentle but serious. You know that this is more than just friendship for me. Michael stepped closer, but he didn't touch me. He simply stood there, looking into my eyes, and I felt the tension between us growing. I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel this, he continued. You matter to me, and I can see how much you're struggling. I don't want to pressure you to make any decisions. I just want you to know I'm here for you. I remained silent, unsure how to respond, but I couldn't ignore what was happening inside me. This was more than just attraction. It was something I had been seeking in my relationship with Tom for so long but had never found. I feel it too, I finally breathed out, meeting his gaze. My words came out quieter than I expected, but they carried the full truth I could no longer deny. In that moment, there was a tense pause between us. I could feel his gaze burning into me. We stood by the edge of the lake, and time seemed to stop. Michael took a step toward me, never breaking eye contact, and before I could fully comprehend what was happening, he gently leaned in and kissed me. That kiss was filled with everything I hadn't felt in so long. passion, tenderness, the desire to be close. The moment stretched into eternity, and I suddenly realized that this moment would change everything. When we pulled away from each other, I stood there, breathing heavily, not knowing what to say. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my thoughts were tangled. But I knew one thing. There was no going back now. Michael softly brushed a strand of hair from my face and quietly said, "I know this isn't easy for you, but I'm here, Lisa. Whatever you decide." His words dissolved into the same silence that had once suffocated me at home. But now it was filled with something different. The realization that my life had changed forever. I understood that this kiss had opened something new, that now I would have to face the consequences I had been trying to ignore for so long. After that kiss, my life with Michael changed, even though on the surface everything remained the same. We continued meeting in the park, going to workouts, and having coffee at the cafe. But now, every glance, every touch was filled with a hidden passion, a new connection we tried so hard not to show to others. Meanwhile, my meetings with Michael became more frequent. We began avoiding public places, knowing that our small neighborhood was too close-knit for such secrets. Soon, we started seeing each other at his gym after his shifts, late in the evening. There, behind closed doors, we could finally be ourselves, without hiding our emotions or desires. Each meeting with him filled me with the life I had long lost. But with every encounter, my guilt and fear of being discovered grew. Tom, though emotionally distant from me, was a smart and perceptive man. I couldn't escape the thought that sooner or later he would realize something was wrong. And then this illusion of freedom I felt with Michael would shatter in an instant. One evening, after another meeting with Michael, I came home later than usual. Tom was in the kitchen, making himself tea, and I immediately felt his gaze when I entered the room. There was something new in his eyes, something I couldn't understand right away. It wasn't the usual indifference I had grown accustomed to, but something deeper, more conscious. "Where have you been?" he asked unexpectedly. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. His question sounded calm, but there was an undertone of discontent hidden within. "At the gym," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom nodded, but I could see he didn't fully believe me. He looked at me longer than usual, as if trying to read my thoughts. It was in that moment I realized things couldn't go on like this. Every time I met with Michael, the tension inside me grew stronger. I could no longer hide my feelings from Tom or from myself. My meetings with Michael had become more than just an infatuation. They had become what nourished me, what made me feel like I mattered again. But I also knew that this couldn't continue for much longer. The next day, I met Michael at his gym, as usual. But now, our meetings were accompanied by the anxious realization that it could all end at any moment. "Tom suspects something," I said when we were alone in the silence of the locker room. Michael looked at me with concern, but then nodded, as if he had been expecting this moment for some time. "I knew this would happen," he replied quietly. "We can't hide this forever." In that moment, I realized that I could no longer live in constant fear of being found out. I felt like I was on the verge of something important, the moment when I would have to make a choice. Michael was here, but Tom was a part of my life, part of my history, and I couldn't just erase him from my fate. We kissed again, but this kiss was different. It was filled not only with passion, but with the realization that our future was uncertain. I headed to my usual meeting with Michael at his gym. This time I was more anxious than usual, as something inside me told me that the tension was becoming too much. We sat in the locker room, talking, and once again I felt that sense of calm, that feeling of safety being near him, which had become my salvation. But inside, my anxiety kept growing, something I could no longer manage. As our meeting came to an end, Michael gently touched my hands, smiled, and asked, "Will you be okay, Lisa?" I nodded, but deep down I knew I didn't have the answer to that question. Everything had become too complicated. I felt like my life was splitting in two. On one side was Michael, the man who gave me the attention and care I had been craving. And on the other side was Tom, the man I once loved and with whom I had shared so many memories. But this duality couldn't last forever. When I got home that evening, the door was unlocked. It surprised me, but I assumed Tom had just come home earlier. I walked into the house and immediately felt a cold tension in the air. Tom was sitting in the living room, his face dark, his eyes filled with anger and pain. "Where were you?" he asked sharply, not giving me a second to recover from the shock. My voice caught in my throat. I didn't know how to answer because I knew. He had figured it out. It was clear from his gaze. Everything I had feared was right there. He wasn't asking out of formality anymore. He already knew the truth. "Tom?" I began, trying to find some kind of excuse, but he rose from his chair, cutting me off. "Don't, Lisa. I saw you." His voice was quiet but sharp, as if every word was a blow. "I decided to come home early today. I thought we could talk, spend the evening together. But instead, I saw you with him." The world around me began to collapse. Tom's words hit me like a punch. I saw the pain distort his face, but there was also a determination I couldn't argue with. "I don't want to hear your explanations," he continued. "I saw it all myself. I understand that something between us is broken, but I didn't think you'd find a replacement so quickly." I tried to say something, but no words came. I knew that any excuses or attempts to explain would be pointless now. Tom had already made up his mind. "I'm filing for divorce," he said coldly, breaking the silence. "You're free. Do whatever you want." I stood frozen, feeling the world around me crumble. This was the moment I had been so afraid of. Being found out. The end. With no chance to fix anything. Tom didn't give me a chance to explain, and what could I have said anyway? Everything happened so fast, so painfully, that I didn't have time to process what was happening. "Tom, wait." I tried again, but he was already leaving the room, leaving me behind in silence. The door slammed shut, and I was left alone in the empty house with only his words echoing in my mind. Sitting on the couch in the living room, I realized that it was over. My marriage, my life with Tom, everything was destroyed. And although I knew I had lost him emotionally long ago, the reality of this moment was too painful. Michael had offered me a chance at a new life, but I couldn't shake the guilt and emptiness that now consumed me. Tom had left, leaving me alone with this silence and my thoughts. And I understood that maybe this silence was the most terrifying punishment of all. Tom did indeed file for divorce, just as he had promised. Everything happened quickly, without discussion or persuasion. He packed his things, leaving the house that we had so recently bought empty, not only physically, but emotionally. Every room was filled with the spirit of what we had lost, of what we couldn't preserve. And although I knew that our relationship had long been headed for this end, the breakup was still painful and final. Michael was there for me, just as he had promised. He suggested I move in with him, out of town, into his cozy home, where we could escape all the problems and start a new life. At first, this offer seemed like salvation. A new home, a new life, a new person by my side who understood and supported me. It should have brought relief, but instead, doubts lingered. I moved in with Michael a few weeks after the divorce. His home was beautiful, spacious, bright, surrounded by greenery and nature. There was a quietness there, but not the oppressive silence that had filled my house with Tom. This was a peaceful, serene silence, as if the whole world had paused to give me time to heal. But inside, I still couldn't find peace. Michael tried to surround me with care, and in the first few days, it brought comfort. We walked through the forest, had breakfast on the terrace, and enjoyed each moment of quiet and solitude. But the anxiety inside me remained, as if I couldn't fully embrace this new life. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen, Michael suddenly said, "You've become distant, Lisa. You're not the same as before. Is something wrong?" I looked up, feeling the turmoil boiling inside me. He was right. Despite all his efforts, I couldn't shake the guilt and sense of loss that lingered after my breakup with Tom. Even when I was with Michael, my thoughts often drifted back to what had happened. It felt as though the ghost of the past was still present in my life, preventing me from moving forward. I don't know, Michael, I replied quietly. Everything changed too quickly. I thought I was ready to start a new life, but it feels like I haven't let go of the past. Michael watched me intently, his face clouded with a serious expression. He understood me, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He had hoped I could forget everything, but I couldn't. That's okay, he said after a pause. I don't want to rush you, but you need to be honest with yourself. Do you really want to be here? With me? His question hung in the air, and I felt the anxiety in my heart intensify. I knew Michael was sincere, and I appreciated his care. But was I truly ready to leave everything behind and build a new life? Or was I simply running away from the pain, trying to hide in his embrace? I don't know, I finally admitted, lowering my head. I'm confused. I need time to figure things out. Michael didn't push. He simply nodded, understanding that there was nothing more to say at that moment. We sat in silence in the kitchen, each lost in our own thoughts. I realized that I had a long journey ahead to figure out what I really wanted. Days passed, but I still couldn't find peace. My relationship with Michael, which once felt like salvation, now filled me with more doubt. I knew I couldn't build a new future until I had healed the old wounds. At some point, I decided that I needed to be alone. I packed my things and told Michael that I needed time for myself, that I wanted to live apart and think. He accepted my decision with understanding, though I could see that it wasn't easy for him. I rented a small apartment in the city, far from the house that now felt foreign to me and from the people who were part of my old life. I needed time to figure out who I was, to understand what I wanted, and to forgive myself for the mistakes of the past. This new reality wasn't easy, but I knew one thing. I was finally being honest with myself. And although the future seemed uncertain, for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. Several months had passed since I left Michael and moved into my small apartment. It was the first place in a long time where I truly felt free. Free from the obligations that once tied me to Tom, and from the complex emotions I had toward Michael. I was finally alone with myself, and this silence no longer felt frightening as it had before. It was filled with new meaning. The first days were difficult. I often wondered if I had made the right choice. Inside me, contradictions still raged. I missed Michael's attention, his care, and the warmth he gave me. But every time I thought back to our last days together, I realized that my attachment to him wasn't true love, but rather an attempt to escape my own fears and pain. Michael had become an anchor for me at a time when I felt like I was drowning, but I wasn't ready to give him my future. Now, living alone, I slowly began to rediscover myself. I took up the things that once brought me joy, but that I had abandoned in my attempts to save my previous relationships. I started reading books again, taking solitary walks through the park, and listening to music in the evenings with a glass of wine. And in each of these moments, I found pieces of myself. The Lisa I had lost during my marriage to Tom, and in my relationship with Michael. One of the most important realizations was that I needed to learn how to be happy with myself before I could open up to someone else again. I realized that my relationship with Tom had fallen apart, not only because we stopped communicating, but because I had lost my own identity. I had been so focused on saving our marriage that I forgot about myself, about what I truly wanted. And with Michael, I made the same mistake, allowing myself to become dependent on his attention and love. Weeks turned into months, and gradually I began to feel inner peace. The doubts and fears faded, giving way to the understanding that my path didn't have to depend on someone else. I no longer sought salvation in other people. I sought it within myself. One day, while sitting in a small cafe with a cup of coffee, I suddenly realized that I hadn't thought about Tom in a long time. The discovery surprised me. Once he had occupied every thought, every worry of mine. I had tried to save our marriage and then fought with the guilt of its collapse. But now, Tom had become part of my past, and that past no longer caused me pain. That same evening, I decided to meet with Michael. I felt I needed to close this chapter of my life, to explain my feelings to him and thank him for everything he had done for me. We met at the same cafe where our story had begun. He looked a bit sadder than I remembered, but still as attentive and caring as always. "You look good, Lisa," he said with a smile as we sat down at the table. "Thank you, Michael," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've had a lot of time to reflect." He nodded, understanding that this conversation wouldn't be easy. "You've realized that what we had, it was more of an escape than something real, haven't you?" He asked unexpectedly, and I was surprised by his insight. "Yes," I answered honestly. "You helped me realize that I deserve more. You gave me what I lacked in my marriage with Tom, and I'll always be grateful to you for that. But I've also come to understand that I'm not ready to build something new until I've figured myself out." Michael looked at me with understanding. His face showed a mix of sadness and acceptance. "I'll always be here if you need me," he said, not trying to hold me back. "But I'm glad you found yourself. That's the most important thing." Our conversation ended on a positive note, and I felt relieved that we were able to part ways without resentment or disappointment. This was the final step in my journey toward healing. Now I knew that a new life awaited me. A life where I wouldn't depend on who was by my side, where I would build my happiness on my own. I no longer feared being alone. After all, solitude isn't emptiness. It's an opportunity for growth, for self-discovery. And in that moment, I understood that everything was just beginning.